Greetings, lovers everywhere. I'm E-Train, and welcome to E-Train Talks. And today is probably one of the best days on E-Train Talks because, well, first off, I just need to say that when I started researching today's guest, I was pretty amazed to discover just how many accolades she's received. I'm not kidding when I said that she's been honored so many times. I could use the most of our interview just sharing them with you. From the Jeffrey Bilson Award for Historical Fiction for Young Readers to the Sidney Taylor Award from the Association of Jewish Libraries to the Manitoba Young Readers' Choice Award, the Governor General's Literary Award, and she was honored just last year for Best Book of 2022 in the Canadian Children's Book Center's Best Books for Kids and Teens. And that's just to name a few. And what's more amazing is that these honors are so deserved because what my guest writes is not just entertaining, but monumentally important. She's a historical fiction writer who also writes some other genres as well, and she shares the truth in her stories, the truth we all need to hear. I'm so proud to have the incredible storyteller Carol Matus with me today on E-Train Talks. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Ethan. It's really an honor to be here.
Well, it's an honor to have you here because after reading Daniel's story and actually seeing the exhibit at the National Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., I knew that I had to interview you on my podcast. You're such an inspiration, and you really opened my eyes to, I guess you could say, the nitty-gritty of the Holocaust, because so many books for kids that discuss the Holocaust, they're really, I guess, sugar-coated in a sense. But yours, you don't just hear that 7 million Jews died, 2 million Jewish children died. You read the story of one child that's really reflected on the stories of so many others, and it is so admirable, everything that you write.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate that. And I have to say, those are the hardest books that I write, are my Holocaust books. As you know, from looking over all my stuff, I write a lot of historical fiction.
Yeah.
But actually, Holocaust was an area that I didn't not want to write about. I started off writing historical fiction by writing about the war and what happened to the Jewish Danes in the war. And that's because my husband is Danish. And I started, well, actually his father, who was in the resistance, never talked about it. But I was given a book called, Rescue in Denmark. And then I started asking my father-in-law, and he reluctantly started telling me some of the stories. And by this time I was an adult, I was in my early 20s. And I was like, how is it that I'm Jewish? I had a bat mitzvah. I learned about the Holocaust, and no one ever told me that an entire country saved almost their entire Jewish population. And I just felt almost so inspired, but heartbroken at the same time, because I was like, if everybody had done that, and they did it, so it was possible, they proved it was possible, then the Holocaust could not have happened. So they stood up when most people didn't. And it's sort of like, when I started writing science fiction, and the theme was always one person can make a difference. And when I learned the story about the Danish Jews, I was like, well, they were like, one country can make a difference, and they did. And it was really very inspiring. So that's when I wrote my first book sort of about the Holocaust, which was Lisa, followed by a sequel called Jesper. And really, then I was asked to write Daniel's story by the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I said yes immediately, but I don't know what made me do that, because I had been trying to avoid that subject for my entire life. Because when I learned about it when I was in about grade 4, it really changed everything for me, changed my whole perspective on life, on religion, on my whole viewpoint, that such a terrible thing could happen, really sort of soured me on humanity. And yet I said yes. And And we can get into a little bit more later if you want about how that book came about and the exhibit. But in a way, writing it changed my viewpoint of life again, into, weirdly enough, a much more positive viewpoint. Because then you started to see the terrible things, but also the really amazing and heroic, fight that went on. And I just want to say, I have a new Holocaust book out called Struggle for Hope, and it's about the rebellion in Auschwitz. And I think it's just so important to talk about the fact, people say over and over, Jews went like lambs to the slaughter. They didn't. And it's something that's really important. That's sort of almost part of the anti-Semitism that we see. They're weak, they're this, they're that. They just let themselves be murdered, right?
Yeah.
But they resisted at every turn and in every way that they could. Sometimes in small ways, like you see in Daniel's story with Erica, where she says, choose love. That's a resistance. And sometimes in bigger ways, like in Struggle for Hope, where they actually blow up a crematorium, right? So anyways, I'll stop because I'm sure you have another question, but I tend to rattle on. So you just feel free to interrupt anytime and say, wait a minute, I have a question here.
Well, I think what you said about how Jews didn't resist, it shows up in a lot of the stories that you've written. And for instance, and I just read After the War, and when your characters, they were on a journey to Palestine or Israel, but when they were in France, they were attacked by some French soldiers, and when they fought back, the French were kind of shocked and they said like they didn't know that Jews actually fought back when they were attacked. And it's extremely powerful and moving that you really kind of tackle these subjects, like so many in all of your stories that are rarely talked about, and it's also so important that you do that as well.
In After the War, that was interesting because I thought it was actually supposed to be a sequel to Daniel's story.
Oh.
Yeah, but Scholastic didn't want it. So Scholastic was the publisher for Daniel's story, and they were like, no, we don't really want to do a sequel. And I was like, okay. So I just made up new characters and did a sequel anyway in my mind, which was like what happened, because I wanted to know what happened to Daniel after the war. So instead I created new characters and what would happen to somebody after the war, and in my mind, after I did the research, it was going to be this really heroic tale of them traveling, through all these, difficulties, but the research completely changed the book. Every single survivor, and this one was really based on survivor interviews, unlike Daniel's story where I didn't have time to interview survivors, but in After the War, they were based on survivor interviews. And every time I asked them what happened to you after the war, they told me what happened to them during the war.
Oh.
They almost couldn't remember after the war. It was so vivid what happened to them during the war, right? And so traumatic that's what they relived. And so that's why in After the War, so then it became a very different story about a young woman who's really dead inside. And it's really her progression to life. Yes, she gets to Palestine, but it's from death to life, and that's really sort of what I wanted to write about, because that's what I discovered from the survivors. And then I have another one that was very much based on survivor testimony, which was called Greater Than Angels, about young children who were hidden in Le Chambon in France. And again, just meeting them, they had such bravery, really, such bravery and such courage. And yeah, it's something that you'll find in all of my books, even if it's inner courage. And I mean, it doesn't mean that they weren't scared and terrified and
Yeah.
and all the other things, right? That you would be in those circumstances. But yeah, I like to think, there's 1.5 to 2 million children that died, and every single one of them has a story. I mean, I wish I could tell every story.
Yeah. That's so, well, I love your answer. And so you said how Holocaust survivors didn't really tell you about their lives after the war. So how did you research like Ruth's tale after the war?
Well, again, you know, like it I had to do a lot of that part by books.
Mm,
I
mhm.
mean, they would tell me a little bit, but mostly those sort of those sort of journeys I read about, because people did write memoirs, and they did, and there were some memoirs, and there was a lot of academic research. So I did a lot of that through the books, which is the normal way I would do research. And then the flashbacks that you get in After the War for Ruth, those were flashbacks that, probably, often from the survivors. But my research is very mixed. It'll be a mixture of. I remember once looking down on my floor and counting the books. I was curious how many books I had, and I had 50 books on the floor. So I won't read 50 usually for, like I'll maybe read through 3 or 4 or 5, really important books on the topic, and then to take a paragraph here or a chapter there, or right.
Yeah.
So
That makes
books are very important, and then if you can talk to people, of course, that's also really important for the emotion.
yeah.
It's something that you can't get as much out of the books as you can, and from talking to people.
Well, I also think we have to keep in mind that you wrote like Daniel's story and after the war, it was before like Google and all of that. It was, I think, I wasn't born yet, so
Yeah,
I
there
think
was
that,
very little. Yes,
yeah,
it's true. There was very little you could do online. Like I actually can do quite a lot online. I mean, there was some that you could do, and some of it was fantastic. I have a book called The War Within, which is about the Civil War, and it was about Jews that were discriminated against during the Civil War, and yet they were slave owners.
wow.
Yeah, so it's really, and I was able online to find, and it's set in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and I was actually able to find online like whole sort of details of the town they lived in, and so yeah, online has become a much better source as long as you're careful, about what you do. So, but yes, in the olden days, it was, and very much books. And now actually the fantastic thing online, and I'm writing a new Holocaust book, and I'm using online a lot because it will connect you to just like a paragraph in a book. And if you have access to the library, which I do because my husband was a professor, so he can get into these university libraries because they're often academic books, you can buy that or access that chapter.
Wow.
And yeah, and that is a fantastic research tool.
Earlier in the interview, you said that the Holocaust Museum kind of asked you to write the Daniel's story for their exhibit. So was their exhibit like already created, or did they kind of base it off the information that you shared in Daniel's story? And how did
Yeah,
it come to be in the first place?
yeah, great question, and something that everybody always gets wrong. So I'm very happy to be able to clarify it.
Mhm.
First of all, there were no, believe it or not, considering how many books there are now about the Holocaust for young people, there were no books for young people
Wow,
about the Holocaust.
that's
So so they had this idea of doing the exhibit, Daniel's story. That was their idea.
mhm.
And then they were like, we need it, but we want a book to go along with it. So what they did was they contacted the publisher, who happened to be, I happened to be publishing. I wrote a book called Sworn Enemies with that publisher. And in the end, that publisher didn't end up doing the book, but they recommended me. And then Scholastic did the book and they kept me on. So Daniel's story is actually the first or one of the first books, fiction about the Holocaust for young people.
Amazing.
And what they said was kids, in grades 5, grade 6 are reading Night. They're reading Elie Wiesel, and we don't want them to be reading that. It's too much. We want them to have something that's age appropriate. So what the parameters they gave me were, they said, we're doing this exhibit, and they flew me in to Washington to see the exhibit and everything. I had a hard hat, and it was, everything was just sort of being made then, right? And they said, this is what the exhibit is going to look like. What we want you to do is, these are your parameters. There's a boy called Daniel. You make up his family. You can make up where he lives. He's going to go to the ghetto. Then from the ghetto to Buchenwald. And he has to survive. Those were the 4 things, right? So, so in a way, I had to make sure that the ghetto he was going to matched the city he was in, because certain people from certain cities, right, went to different ghettos. And then that would match where he could go, somehow getting him to Buchenwald. And, but those were my only parameters. So some things they did take from me, like his family, Erica, and those were my creations. And some things I took from them. So it's it was kind of a parallel thing. So like a lot of people thought it was a novelization of the exhibit. It wasn't, but it also wasn't, they also didn't take the exhibit from my book, right? It was sort of a parallel stream going. The other thing was the exhibit was opening, I'm trying to think when it opened, May or June? I'm trying to think. I was there, they brought me in, and I heard Elie Wiesel speak. Wow. And yes, President Clinton. Yeah. It was pouring rain, and my mom came with me, and we stood at the back in a field of mud because we weren't VIPs, right? We were right at the back of the huge crowd outside, but it was still quite an amazing experience. And anyway, they gave me 3 months to write that book. Yeah. And I had never written about the Holocaust because I was upset about the Holocaust. And then I had 3 months to do it. It was crazy. It was crazy. And then and there were many times I thought I couldn't do it, but I had one interesting experience, which was a kind of spiritual experience, which sort of told me that I was on the right track. I wrote a scene one afternoon, and I was just living and breathing it. And I had 2 small children at the time, so it wasn't that I just had all the time in the world. But I was sort of, reading when they were at school, and I was staying up till 2 or 3 every morning. And unlike a lot of my books, I would research first and then write, sort of very orderly. But in this case, I would be researching and writing, and then researching and writing, and it was all kind of mixed in together. No time to interview anyone. So there was no actual interviews. And one day I wrote a scene, and that was the scene where Daniel almost dies, and his mother brings him soup in the dream, and then he wakes up and he's better. And then that night, I read that exact same thing in a book called Hasidic Tales from the Holocaust. And it was the exact story, but I read it after I wrote the scene. I was like, okay, I must be on the right track, sort of, zoned in. Writers often call it when you're in the zone. And but then I remember I sent in the book, and in those days we used faxes, right? That's how people communicated. And my fax machine went off. Ooh. And 20 pages in teeny tiny print, like tiny print, came through about things that they thought I'd gotten wrong and that I had to correct, after the first draft. Yeah. So, and funny thing is, they had their own experts, and I had used an expert that they didn't like. And it's kind of funny because, and so I changed it all. But then later, when I was interviewing the people for Greater Than Angels, those Holocaust survivors, they were like, oh yeah, the museum, like they're just crazy. They have that expert and they love that expert, but we love the expert that you like. I told them the story and I said I used, Martin Gilbert was actually the expert that I used, and they were like, oh, hello, Kat. And they were
I
like,
did not know he was in my room.
and they were like, oh yeah, we love your expert. You didn't need to change any of that. And I was like, well, I did change it, so it's fine. But anyway, that was, yeah. So, and then you were talking before also about not talking down to the characters and sort of telling the truth. And I think very much in this case, and in the case of Lisa and Jesper, I started to write for the age of the character, not for the age the publisher wanted me to write for. In other words, if I'm writing about an 11-year-old, then I write from the point of view of an 11-year-old. And I don't worry, is this for grades 4, 5, and 6, or is it for 7, 8, and 9? And then I don't have to worry about talking down or not talking down. I just have to be honest and write for that age and write what a person that age would be feeling and thinking, right?
Right.
And that hopefully is what brings that honesty that you were talking about, and the sort of not shying away from things, because I feel those, I just have to be true to my character, really. But it's a very different way than a lot of writers write, who write for a specific age.
So you said that it's important for kids to read stuff that it's for their age group, it's appropriate for them, but I also think it's important. So if they're reading something that's too old for them, they also might not understand or grasp why it's important that they're reading it at all. So I think that's why Daniel's story is so, it needs to be read in classrooms and libraries, because it features a kid that, and it's appropriate, but it also is eye-opening.
I've also complained, to my family and to anyone who will listen, why can't adults read them? Like, so many adults come up to me and say, oh, I read this with my child and I really liked it. And they were like, sound so shocked. And I'm like, why are you shocked? It's just, you'll read a book about a 90-year-old and you're not 90 and you might like it. And you can read a book about an 11-year-old and you're not 11 and you can like it. Like, you don't have to read about, it would be crazy if I was like, I'm only reading books about the person that's exactly my age right now, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't really make sense to me. So yeah, children's literature can be weird that way,
Yeah.
I mean, I do think we like to read about people our own age and people that are going through what we're going through, and that's fine. But yeah, that doesn't mean you can't read Who's Looking, which is about two little kids, or you couldn't read something. I mean, I know a lot of young people read books, adult books, that because they find them interesting, like fantasies, or right.
Yeah, and I think
So yeah.
That's a perfect segue. I love
Okay.
when segues come perfectly
Okay.
to my next question. It's about the topic of book banning, and you've shared how adults, they can read kids books, kids can read adult books, and that's really a big topic that is being discussed when we're talking about book banning. So what is your opinion on book bannings, and why are, I guess a question that I could also include in this is, why do you think they're really being talked about more now if books have always been banned?
I think we're in a very dangerous period right now.
Mhm.
Right now, I'm this new book that I'm writing is about the period before Hitler took power.
Oh.
It's set in 1935 in Germany, and the rise of fascism is terrifying to study when you look at what's happening right now all over the world. Fascism needs that kind of us and them, and so they need scapegoats. And unfortunately, although the Jews were a very small percentage of the population in Germany, they became the scapegoat. But getting back to your question about book banning, I was thinking about it the other day, and I was like, You know what people should do? Whenever a book is banned in a school, they should have like a human chain so that everyone goes out and buys that book and circulates it from home to home,
I
so
love
that
that.
every kid in that school gets to read that book. Like, even if everyone chipped in 25 cents, you could afford that book, right? If everyone did it together, you could afford that book, read it out of school, and have your discussions outside of school, and make sure that whatever book so that they don't have that control, because that's all it's about, that control. And if you can take back that control and say, no, okay, you ban that book, we're buying that book. In fact, we're going to buy 30 of those books. You don't have to buy 30.
Yeah.
But, even if there's some kind of a human chain that goes around, the city or the county or the area where it's banned, I don't know. That was just an idea that came to me the other day. But
I love that idea.
they're banning those books because those books are inclusive, and those are the books that will help people not become racist.
By now, you think that more people would be knowledgeable and less hateful towards Jews. And I also saw that Jews take up about 2% of the entire population um, of the US, and they receive 55% of the hateful comments that are based on religion and all that. So why do you think this cycle of hate and misinformation against the Jewish people continues? And did you ever experience anti-Semitism as a kid?
Okay, well, I'll take the first part first, which is it's okay. So Judaism, anti-Semitism is called the oldest hatred.
Mhm.
And it really began, not long after the death of Christ, when, a few hundred years later, when the Gospels were written, and Jews were blamed for the death of Christ, which was all a lie, because it wasn't the Jews that crucified Christ. And he was a Jew, actually. But anyway, that became part of the church doctrine. And unfortunately, that is really the root of it, because the Christians of the time wanted the Jews, like there was a break-off sect, right? It was a break-off. They broke off from the Jews and they became a different sect. And they decided that, and the ones that sort of stayed as Jewish, decided that Christ was like a prophet, but not a Messiah. And the others said he was the Messiah. And they blamed the Jews for his death. And it wasn't the Jews, it was the Romans. But they then perpetrated that. Priests, the popes, this idea that the Jews killed Christ. And even, during, in many of my Holocaust books, I have scenes where, like a priest will say to his congregation, you need to, hate the Jews because they killed Christ. Like, they used to preach it from the pulpit. And there were, of course, righteous Christians and righteous, so I don't want to leave them out because it wasn't monolithic. But that was very much where that sort of came from and sort of stayed throughout the centuries. So very long time, very deeply ingrained. And because of that, the laws were made so that Jews weren't allowed to do things that other people did. Like they were only allowed to be moneylenders, for instance, or they weren't allowed to own shops, or they weren't allowed. And then they got reputations of, they only care about money. Well, it's not they only cared about money, but that was the only thing they were allowed to do, was to be a moneylender, right? So the prejudice sort of put them into positions where then the prejudice even grew worse, because they weren't looked at as normal and part of the society. So, in Germany, they were, I think, 0.1% of the population. I mean, teeny tiny. There were only like 500,000 Jews in Germany. I mean, 3 million Jews died in Poland, but in Germany, there were only 500,000 Jews. They couldn't possibly have caused all the damage that Hitler said they did and destroyed the world and destroyed the economic system, and they were the cause of everything. It was absolutely impossible. So on the one hand, you have them saying about Jews that they're so powerful, right? That they cause everything. And on the other hand, it's such a tiny minority, right? That it couldn't possibly be true. So you're kind of like, every once in a while when I hear this, I'm like, yeah, it's great. Apparently, we run the world. Wow, that's awesome. I did not suffer any anti-Semitism when I was a kid, none, like ever. But I feel like just learning about the Holocaust sort of skewed my whole viewpoint anyway, because I felt it. I felt it. I felt that, at any moment that could happen like that because, because I'm a Jew, I'm part of that group, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I think that especially reading about the Holocaust, and while I have experienced like direct anti-Semitism, I still feel like hearing all the anti-Semitism that's going on in the world and also reading about the Holocaust and everything in the past as well, like it may not be directly towards you, but it's still, I guess, it's being directed towards your people.
Yeah.
And that is you. You are a Jew, and people are hating Jews, which kind of means that people hate, I guess, maybe for one very far-fetched and not even true reason. And they
Yeah.
hate you. And that is anti-Semitism. And while it's not like someone doing the Heil Hitler sign to you, it is it's still anti-Semitism. And you can't say that it's not because it is, frankly. Well,
Yeah.
on a bit of a lighter note, let's talk a bit
Yes.
about
Let's go
who's
lighter.
looking, how
Oh,
animals see the world. So I know that there is a very sweet story behind how animals see the world, who's looking. And do you mind sharing that with us?
yeah, that was that. And you're right. And by the way, when I was, sort of until about 7 or 8 years ago, when I stopped writing at that speed, I would write 2 books a year. I would write one serious book, like a Holocaust book or a historical, and then I would write, like, as you said, a fantasy or science fiction, or because you just can't write that all the time, right?
Yeah,
So I've always written picture books, but I've never been able to get one published. I wrote my first one when my daughter was like 2. It's still not published. I still think it's a good book, but no one will take it. So, but I keep trying, And one day, my grandson and I were walking home from the park. He was around 6 at the time. He's 11 now. And the book just came out last year. And we stopped, and we talk a lot. The two of us, we're both talkers. We're both, talk.
me too.
So yeah, so we love spending time together and just talking away. And we had to stop for traffic, and we were looking down, and I saw these ants, running around, and I just had this idea, and I said, what do you think we'd look like to them? And he was like, huge, giant. And I was like, yeah, and I wonder what we'd look like to, sort of some of the others. And that gave us another thing to talk about, right, on the way home as we were walking home. But once I got home, I was like all authors, I mean, I've got a list of books, so many that have never been published, so many more than have been published, right? Hundreds, I'm sure, of ideas, and most of them you don't get published. Like, you either don't develop them, or it's nobody likes them, or like it's like batting. It's like baseball. I love baseball.
Me too.
And if you're batting, do you as well?
Yeah, I'm a huge sports fan, so baseball is definitely one of my
Yeah.
favorites.
Yeah. And so if you're batting 300, you're doing great. But think about it. That means, the rest of the time you're striking out, right?
Yeah.
And I think publishing is very much like that. So, but I got that idea and I wrote it up, and my agent liked it enough. She won't send out stuff she doesn't like. So she liked this enough to send it out. And the interesting thing was that it was very basic when she sent it out, but Orca took it. But then it really changed a lot. So it went through like 28 drafts. I counted them.
Wow.
Yeah, really a lot of drafts. And it was hard because it's nonfiction. And so it was my first picture book and my first nonfiction book. So I had a really steep learning curve. But yeah, I mean, it's about, like, I had first pictured all the pictures would be how an animal sees things. So my picture would be like the whale, for instance, which you have in the book. The whole picture would be just how a whale sees, which is black and white. But the publisher was like, no, if we do that, young kids won't really be able to relate. Like if it's a fuzzy picture, they won't know what they're looking at, right? Like an ant who can't see properly and everything's fuzzy. What are they looking at? So they wanted a bit of a mix of both human sight and animal sight.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and then it was actually the illustrator that came up with this idea of doing a line. So you can see the animal sight, and then beyond that is the human sight. Yeah, you can sort of show one of the pictures.
Yeah, and speaking of whales, I flipped right to the whales.
Oh, perfect. Yes. And you can sort of see that there's the gray on one side, right?
Yeah.
And then you can see the line of sight, and you can see the colors on the other. And that was really genius on her part. You know, she came up with that idea. And it was perfect kind of match, right? Because now each page you can see sort of how we would see it with the colors. And then of course there's the big challenge. There's some birds, for instance, who see colors and ultra ray and all things that we don't see at all. So how do you show that? And she just tried to make it very vibrant and very, right, so it had a lot of challenges. And also it may seem simple, that language, but oh my gosh, trying to get that technical language into language that scientists wouldn't yell at me and say that's not right, right? And yet a 4-year-old could understand, right? And in this case I did have to think about the age of the child, right? So that was really difficult, and that was mostly the rewriting of trying to get that sort of sort of really scientific explanations for how that particular animal sees into language that a little kid could understand. It was fun though,
It
super
does
fun.
sound like fun.
It
And
was,
it
yeah.
was just reading it, it was such a wonderful story. And I think also adding the aspect of the two siblings together, and like the older one is showing the world to this. So these are the two on the cover. You have the older sibling and the younger one. It's just such a sweet book.
And again, that was not my idea. That was my agent's idea, who's like, well, maybe you should make a story. Publisher had already bought it as it was. But she was like, why don't you make more of a story? And then I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll make a baby and an older sister. And then I was like, oh, well, maybe I should also make it through different seasons. And that will be more interesting because you'll see the different seasons. And then I was like, okay, and then we have to make it at different times of day. So it became really complicated because then I had to age out the sister and the baby properly. I had to do the seasons properly per each animal. And then I had to do the time of day properly so that it all fits in sequence with the book.
Wow,
So
I had no idea.
it became, I know, it was like, it started off as just this very simple thing of this animal and that animal see like this. And then it turned into a whole story, which I think made it a much better book.
I do too.
Yeah, so I'm very thankful for her idea.
Well, I'm thankful that you wrote this book and that Cornelia Lee
Yeah,
illustrated it. And
yeah.
sadly, it's
Great.
time for the final question of the interview.
Okay.
This one is one that I ask every single person that I've ever interviewed.
Okay.
So no pressure. So if you
I'm scared.
don't worry, don't worry. So if you could be or if you could meet any literary character, and by that I mean you could meet your favorite author, or if
Uh-huh.
you could meet maybe your favorite book character of all time, and it can be anybody from your stories as well. It doesn't have to be somebody else's book. Who would it be and why?
Okay. I actually think I would pick Frank L. Baum. He is the author of the Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz stories.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And he, I think, is basically my inspiration for writing, even though my books are completely different. I just cannot tell you how much I love those books. And that really made me, I think, the reader that I am. I still love them. Like they're just, they are so imaginative, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I still remember reading this section where Dorothy lands. It's not the Wizard of Oz. It's one of the sequels, and she lands on a beach. And there's a tree, and the tree grows lunch boxes, like on a stem, right? And you pick off the lunchbox and you open the lunchbox, and they all have little stems, but there's a little sandwich that's made, with wrapping paper, and there's an apple, and like, who thinks of that? Like a lunchbox, made out of stem. Like, I just, and that particular image has always stayed with me because I just thought, who can come up with that? It's so fabulous. And I think my greatest joy when I write is doing a first draft and coming up with a lot of writers hate the first draft, by the way. They would much rather do a second or third draft and work on the technical stuff but I love the first draft because that's where your imagination can you're creating your characters, you're creating the story, you're just creating everything out of nothing, really. In fact, there's a very famous children's book called Something Out of Nothing. But and to me that's a joyful experience. And actually right now I'm working on another picture book that just got accepted, so yay, I will not be a one-time wonder. And I'm working on a sort of fantasy about a psychic and another Holocaust book, so lots of different things. And though that's great to be able to not just stick with one thing, and so your imagination gets to work on different things and different levels, and it's really fun.
Well, I hear authors always say that when they send in one book to an agent or a publisher, when they're querying, they have two other manuscripts that they've already done. So do you feel like that's kind of that's how you write as well? You have like all these stories finished and like, oh, we love your book. Now can we have another? And then you're just turning another one in and after another. Or do you are you kind of like a slow writer, I guess?
I'm a fast writer. Once, like when I'm doing a first draft, I'll do a first draft in 2 or 3 weeks, which
Wow.
is pretty fast. But then it'll take me a year or two to do the second. I'm the kind of writer that will do 30 drafts, so that's, whereas other kinds of writers will take a year to do a first draft, right? So I tend to write fast and then rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And sometimes I get an editor, like I have handed in a manuscript where the editor is like, this isn't good enough, and turned it down. It fortunately doesn't happen that often, because usually I work with people who know that's the way I work, and they know that the second draft will be way better than the first draft. So they cut me slack, right?
Yeah.
On the first draft. And that's just, yeah, that's sort of the way the way that I work. And it's good because you do tend to write a lot that way, because yeah, you always have something going, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I've just got to say thank you so, so much for joining me today, Carol. It has been such a treat, and I cannot wait for well, I just can't wait to read more of your books. I've only read 3 so far, and you have 47 now with Who's Looking. And
Yeah.
I guess I have 44 more of your books to read, and
I
I'm
hope
so
so.
excited for each one.
I hope so. And I also have like, I think 7 that I wrote with a co-writer, Perry Nodelman, that you might want to read as well. So yeah, this has really been fun. And I just want to say back to you
Thank you.
how amazing it is that you are such an emissary and a spokesperson for writing and reading. And I think kids must find it just really inspiring to have somebody of their own age talking to them about books that you like and that you appreciate, instead of us older peeps doing it. And so it's very inspiring, I know, for me, and I'm sure for the other writers that you interview as well. So big kudos back to you.
Thank you. And I sure hope that other kids find this inspiring as well, because I this podcast is for all ages, but I also hope that some kids discover their next read, whether they're like reluctant readers or
Mhm.
they love books. Because my main goal is to shine a light on stories that I love and I'm sure other people will love, as well as other topics like book banning and anti-Semitism and so much more. If I know that if I just get, like, for instance, Daniel's story into the hands of, like, maybe one kid or one adult, that's kind of the main reason why I have my podcast in the first place, to inspire others and make sure everybody loves books, because books, as you said, they're the antidotes to all problems.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much.
Right.
Maybe not when you're actually sick, but I mean, I think
Right.
you find that joy when you're sick, when you're reading.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, but even then, you can lose yourself in a book, right? Yeah. Yeah.
So
Okay.
once again, thank you so much for joining me, Carol, and everybody. You need to read Daniel's story, Who's Looking, After the War, and every single one of Carol's books. Well, maybe not every single one, because I know that a lot of you are adults, so you've got some jobs to do. But when you find some time, I know you'll love Carol's writing, and I know I do. Have a great day. Keep on reading. Bye.